to advance the catheters and do the procedure. So the junior fellow is at the groin because we're passing the catheter through the femoral artery. And the staff person, so as you're advancing the catheter up the aorta, let's say here's the aorta, you're advancing the catheter up higher and higher because you want it to kind of follow the curve of the aortic arch back into the heart. And the faculty and I are looking at the screen, at the monitor, and we're looking at the catheter, and so the faculty person tells the junior fellow, he says, move the catheter higher. In other words, advance the catheter up into the aortic arch. And we're looking, and the fellow's not moving the catheter higher, so he screams again, move it higher. And we don't see any movement. So we look at the fellow, and he's holding the catheter up like this. Let me say this. If you don't know anything, that's a simple to say to me. It's something that years later you can laugh about. But when, in the moment, like when it first happens, like the staff person was really angry. You know? And it's one of those things that you have to suppress laughter for, because if you laugh, then that's not cool with the senior guy. You know, it's all about sucking up. Kissing up to whoever's the next guy up. So it's like, I looked at this, I can't believe you did that. And then you let everyone know once you get out. Well, you know, you're going to find that in NDT. Yeah. All right. We can take a break. And then just tell us one story. I think it's one of my favorites. On the surface of the ventricle. Well, as blood is flowing down, it then travels from the LAD through little branches like this into the myocardium. Coronary artery disease refers to blockages, cholesterol plaques, that can develop within these arteries here, that can block or obstruct blood flow. If someone has blockages that are severe enough, then the myocardium can become ischemic, meaning it can lack sufficient blood flow with oxygen, in which case the patient experiences chest pain called angina, angina pectoris. This is chest pain due to myocardial ischemia, due to blockages. Some people say angina. I say angina. Either one is correct. You can say angina. I don't like the way it sounds. I say angina. Tomato. Okay. Potato. The people say potato. Craziness. All right. This is a view here of the heart from the right side. What's happened is we've made an incision on the right side and reflected back the right ventricular wall. Okay. Now, so we're looking from the right atrium here down upon the surface of the tricuspid valve. So this is the interatrial septum. Okay? And you can see blood is flowing. That's the opening of the coronary sinus. And just above it here is the famous fossa ovalis. A fossa is a shallow depression. This fossa ovalis is a remnant of an opening that used to be present during fetal life that connected the two atria. That opening was called the foramen ovale. Well, around the time of birth, that opening closes, leaving only a trace of what it used to be, just a shallow depression called fossa ovalis. Now, if we open up the right side even more, here's that ridge that sits along the beginning and proximal part of the pulmonary outflow tract here. It's called the supraventricular crest. Okay? And the outflow tract is called the conus arteriosus. Is the pulmonary valve. Here you can see the superior and inferior cave emptying into the right atrium. Pectinate muscle. All right, here we're looking at the surface of the heart. What I like about this picture is, remember the pulmonary trunk is the anteriormost vessel, right behind it is the ascending aorta. And you can see the coronary arteries coming off the ascending aorta. Here's the right coronary artery, here's the left main. The left main only extends for about 1 to 2 centimeters, then it bifurcates into the LAD, which travels down to an apex, and a circumflex, which wraps around. You'll notice that there's corresponding veins that sit right next to the coronary arteries. But we don't call these coronary veins. They're called cardiac veins. Now, the major cardiac veins I want you to know is this one right here that travels next to the LAD. That's called the great cardiac vein. I like calling it the great cardiac vein. There was a movie, Ruth, called The Great Santini. Did you see that?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. I'll give you another 10 points if you watch that one.
Okay.
All right? Just write these down. On Netflix. The Great Santini. Well, this is the great cardiac vein. Okay? And so what's happening is the LAD is delivering blood flow with oxygen to the myocardium. Once that blood gives up its oxygen to the heart muscle, the unoxygenated blood is going to return back to the right atrium through the great cardiac vein. If we look at the back of the heart, okay, this is the posterior interventricular sulcus here. Okay? And this vein that's in the middle of the posterior wall is called the middle cardiac vein. You have other cardiac veins here, anterior cardiac veins. The idea is that these cardiac veins are going to carry unoxygenated blood that's already given up oxygen to the myocardium and return it to the right atrium. The way it does so is that these veins all empty into this larger venous structure called the coronary sinus. So the great cardiac vein is going to travel into the coronary sinus. The middle cardiac vein is traveling into the coronary sinus. All the cardiac veins are delivering blood to the coronary sinus, which is then going to empty right here into the right atrium. Left atrium looks like this. Best seen from the posterior view. This is the right atrium. Inferior vena cava, superior vena cava. This guy is Frank Netter, a very famous medical illustrator. He has a series of images, an atlas, which is very famous. Right now, he's dead now. I met him once. What's interesting is that as you go through life, you end up meeting a lot of famous people. Have you all met some famous people before?
Mm-hmm.
Who's the most famous people you've met?
Who, me?
Yeah, you said yes. You said
I've met people from bands like Styx and
really?
yeah.
Wow. That's pretty good.
My dad was very good friends with Frank Gorshin, who played the original Batman, the original.
I remember that. Wow.
Yeah.
He was on the TV series.
Yeah, very
He was
good
good.
friend of my father's.
Wow.
Most of the people that I've met that are famous are older.
Do you know who Penn and Teller are?
Yeah.
Okay, so I went to Las Vegas. And so my wife and I'm interested in magic. So I wanted to make sure we signed up for the Penn and Teller show. And I mentioned to one of the people at the show who worked with Penn and Teller, just make it, while we were waiting for the show, I just was making small talk. And I mentioned to her that, yeah, I'm a magician myself. So she said, oh, I want you to hang around after the show. So after the show, she takes me back to meet Penn and Teller. Okay? And he's a very famous, they have a TV show. So the one who can talk, Penn, asked me to show him some of my stuff. You know, so I did like it's called a French drop. I did a few little tricks for him. And it was, so I said, oh, let's take some pictures. And so it was a lot of fun meeting Penn. Teller actually talks. But on the TV show, he doesn't. I met Joe Biden before. You know Joe Biden is? He's running for president.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a nephew who graduated from the Air Force Academy, and either the president or the vice president always is the speaker for graduation. So we had a reception afterwards, and it was a small group. So I met him. I can tell you, I met, who's the old guy who does a talk show on TV? Larry King. Y'all know who Larry King is? So this was funny. At one of these cardiology conventions, they had a number of invited guests, and at each table, there was one of them. And so I sat right next to Larry King, and I ate supper with him. It was pretty cool. Larry and I were like buddies.
Have you ever heard of the Gold Diggers?
I know what the Gold Diggers are with Dean Martin.
Yes. When I was 13, on my 13th birthday, my dad took me on my first date, and he brought me to the Blue Room, and he was very good friends with the maitre d', and they put a table right in the front, and I got a picture with the, I'm gonna bring you the picture and show you, but
Wow.
all you can see are these women.
They're like strippers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's women and me right in the middle. It's hysterical. It's hysterical. I was 13 at the time. I was so embarrassed. I'm like, do I really have to get my picture taken with them? And he's like, yeah.
That's a little unusual.
But yeah, they sang happy birthday to me. They put on a show in the Blue Room, and my sister got to see Tony Bennett, and then my other sister got to see Lou Rawls.
So like, that's ordered into the Gold Digger show.
To the Blue Room, yeah.
Oh, wow. Back then, times are different.
Yeah.
Like, that could be considered like,
Child abuse.
yeah.
That's about how I felt.
All right. We're learning a lot about people. All right, let's keep going. Now, this time we're opening the left side of the heart. You can tell because the wall is thicker. So this would have to be the mitral valve. Anterior leaflet, posterior leaflet. Anterior papillary muscle, posterior papillary muscle. Okay. This has to be the circumflex wrapping around the back. There's the coronary sinus. Okay. This is the left side, so that's the left atrial appendage or auricle. These have to be the two left pulmonary veins. This is a nice view because you can see the left atrium opening into the atrial appendage. The atrium is a site where clots can form. Particularly if you have certain arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation. An atrial fibrillation is a common type of cardiac arrhythmia that develops as people age. When people with atrial fibrillation develop a clot, it typically occurs in the atrial appendage because the walls of the atrial appendage are not as contractile. They don't move as much, so blood tends to be a little more stagnant here. So oftentimes when they do cardiac surgery, they'll close the atrial appendage. They'll flip it so that you don't form a clot there. All right. So this is a hemodynamic chart that graphs out left ventricular pressure. So this is left ventricular pressure during diastole. And with the onset of systole, look, it climbs. Okay, and as pressure climbs, it's going to force close the AV valves and force open the semilunar valve so that blood can be ejected. So here we see systole. You see the ventricles contracting and blood moving up through. In this case, this would be the aortic valve. Here's the left atrium. Notice that when the ventricle contracts, the mitral valve closes. Now, when this valve closes with contraction of the ventricle, it creates that first heart sound, the love of the love dove. Now, as the ventricle completes ejection and begins to relax, blood moves retrograde, closing this valve at the onset of diastole, and as the pressure falls, the AV valve opens, allowing the ventricle to fill with blood from the atrium. With the onset of relaxation and the closure of the semilunar valve, you get the second heart sound. So at the onset of systole, S1, at the onset of diastole, S2. Notice that the atria contract, okay, right here at the tail end of diastole. So right before the ventricles contract during systole, the atria contract. So atrial systole occurs during the tail end of ventricular diastole. We can call that event the atrial kick. Okay? So what's happened during diastole is this valve is opening and blood is filling up the ventricle. And at the tail end of this process, the atrial walls contract so that any remaining blood gets shunted down. So any additional blood that's still remaining in the atria gets forced down into the ventricles. That's why you see this little bump here in the pressure curve. This is one of my favorite pictures of all time. This is a kind of a view of a boat looking down upon the base of the heart. And just to orient you, anterior is up there, posterior is down here. Okay, this is left, this is right. Okay? And so we can look at this image, and based upon whether the valves are open or closed, we can say this is either systole or diastole. Which is this? Diastole, because the AV valves are open. Okay? And the semilunar valves are closed. On the other hand, down here is systole, a view from systole, where the semilunar valves open and these AV valves closed. Love dog. There's a movie. What's it called? Was it called The Lion of Wall Street?
Wolf of Wall Street.
The Wolf of Wall Street, yeah. And Matthew McConaughey is meeting with one of the main characters. Who's he meeting with in the restaurant?
Leonardo DiCaprio.
DiCaprio. And he's talking about the heartbeat. Love Dove. That's what he was talking about, folks. Did y'all catch that? That's one. That's two. Boom, boom. Boom, boom. He was talking about getting it in sync. When you have an arrhythmia, they're out of sync. But it's all about getting it. Yeah. Give another 10 points. Wolf of Wall Street.
What's that?
Ruth and I are the only people. What I like about Ruth is I can throw out a reference, and Ruth will be the only one that gets it.
What's
Yeah.
that?
My references.
Oh.
And I mentioned some of these references, the gold diggers. Nobody else knew who these gold digger strippers were. No. Okay? But you actually spent time with them, which is what I like. All right. Okay. This is a more complicated image here. This is one that I want you to kind of commit to memory. A lot of times, the beautiful thing about anatomy and physiology is that oftentimes the way you can learn it is by drawing. You know, they're well suited to drawing on a whiteboard. So you can recreate these graphs and it helps you to learn. So what we have here in blue is that ventricular pressure tracing. That's the little bump, atrial systole. Here's the onset of ventricular systole, diastole. We start again. Okay? But in addition, in purple here, I'm going to call this purple. It's really probably more like chartreuse or something. Okay? This is the atrial pressure curve. Okay? So purple there is left ventricle. No, I said it wrong. Blue is left ventricle. The chartreuse is the left atrium. Everybody with me? Now, notice that this part here is diastole. When I say diastole, I mean ventricular diastole. And during during diastole, the atrial and the ventricular pressure curves are almost superimposed. They're almost the same. And the reason is during diastole, that mitral valve is wide open. And so the two chambers become like one. Okay? So let's say this is the left atrium. Oh man, this is not working. Probably you can keep this. Let's suppose that this is the left atrium, and this is the left ventricle, and here's the valve in between. Okay, left atrium, left ventricle. If this valve is wide open, then these two chambers, in essence, become one. And so their pressures almost become superimposed. Okay? That's during diastole. With the onset of ventricular systole, when its three walls contract, the valve does what? It closes. So pressure rises within the left ventricle, but it's not going to rise in the left atrium. So you can see that these pressure curves separate. Here the ventricular pressure goes up, the atrial pressure remains relatively low. It's not going to see that higher pressure head because the valve between the two chambers closes. And instead, blood is going to be shunted up into the aorta, like this. Okay. So, there is going to be an early part of systole where the mitral valve closes and the aortic valve has not yet opened. Okay? So pressure within the ventricle is rising, but the volume within the ventricle is not changing because we have a closed space. So this is called isovolumetric contraction. This initial part of systole, where the volume doesn't change because the valves are all closed. Isovolumetric contraction. Now, as the left ventricular pressure climbs, it'll reach a point where the pressure within the ventricle is higher than the pressure within the aorta. And that's going to cause the aortic valve at this point to open. Okay? And we call that the ventricular ejection phase. Notice during the ventricular ejection phase, the pressure in the aorta, which is represented here in green, becomes the same as the pressure within the ventricle. Why? Because during ventricular ejection, this valve, if it functions normally, is wide open, and these two chambers, the aorta and the left ventricle, become one. So the pressure becomes superimposed during the ventricular ejection phase. Okay. So it begins where the aortic valve opens. Now, when the ventricle begins to relax, okay, its walls begin to expand again, pressure falls, and blood begins to move retrograde, closing this valve. Okay? At that point, the pressures divert. The aortic pressure separates from the ventricular pressure, which is falling. This period of time, at the onset of diastole, where the aortic valve is closed, but the mitral valve has yet to open, that's called isovolumetric relaxation. And it's all laid out here in this diagram. Once the pressure falls below the pressure within the left atrium, in other words, once ventricular pressure drops below the pressure within the left atrium, the mitral valve opens, and the atrial and ventricular pressures again become superimposed. It's during this phase that the ventricle is filling with blood from the atrium. So this is ventricular filling phase. At the tail end, you get atrial systole, the atrial kick. This is a good chart to study, to memorize. Notice that with closure of the mitral valve, you get the first heart sound. With closure of the aortic valve, you get the second heart sound. Here's your lug, here's your dove. Boom, boom. Boom, boom. Okay? It's slapped and closed the valve. These are your waveforms from the EKG. The P wave represents depolarization of the atrium. It's going to come right before atrial systole. In other words, the atrial muscle has to depolarize before it contracts. The QRS represents ventricular depolarization. The ventricular muscle has to depolarize before it contracts. So this is going to precede ventricular systole. Everything's going to correlate. This is ventricular volume. It's greatest at the end of diastole. With the onset of systole and ejection, ventricular volume falls. Okay. Does everybody know each other here, by the way? We're missing some folks. I know we're missing Erica and Elena. Everyone else knows each. Do y'all know Erica and Elena? Okay. You have anything to say about them now's the time? Of course, I'm being silly. Yeah. Of course, that's not true. We would not want to talk about them when they're not here. Okay. Although, that would seem more suitable.
We'll wait till they get in.
I'm kidding. Everybody, so, Carla, Caroline, Matthew, you and I go way back. Yes? A and P, 2? Yeah. Ray, 2. Peace, 2. Josie, 1 and 2. Ruth,
1.
1.
And Dr. Wagner.
Caleb, O. First time? Holly, 1 and 2? Okay. Yeah, this is like old times. This is like, yeah, Back to the Future. Extra credit.
Cool. Oh, I know, I'm glad.
Hold on.
We'll watch movies. What movies did he say today, you guys? Oh, I could. Great scene. Back to the Future.
So I watched a movie. My wife and I watched a movie. I can't remember what it was called. It was about this guy who thought he could space travel. It's on Netflix. It was really good. Like, oftentimes I'll pick a movie and my wife doesn't want to see it. You know, she wants me to watch one of the movies that she likes, which are usually disaster movies. But they're all the same. They all have the same plot. Okay, the last night I got to watch one that I wanted. It was about time travel, which was good. I like those movies. Okay, so this shows some normal pressures. You can take, watch this. A while back I came up with a saying. Have you all heard of it before with regard to drawing a picture?
A picture's worth a million.
Billion.
No. Someone else had said it. No, I came up with something better than that. Listeners, a picture. Kayla, write this down. A picture is worth a billion words. A billion. Okay. Got that down?
Yeah.
A picture is worth a billion words. That's so true of anatomy. So let's draw here. explain this picture to you here. Okay, so this here's the pulmonic valve. And right behind it is the ascending aorta. Okay, here's the mitral valve. Okay. So here's the ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending thoracic aorta. Here's the abdominal aorta, and it bifurcates into the common iliacs, and then the common iliacs give rise to the external iliacs. Okay, once the external iliacs pass the inguinal ligament, they become the femoral artery. All right, so you can take a catheter and advance it from the femoral artery all the way back up, like this, and up around the arch, and you can pass that catheter into the left ventricle. Okay? So I can directly measure pressure within the left ventricle, and I can pull the catheter back and measure pressure within the aorta. Okay? I can also advance the catheter through the femoral vein up into the inferior vena cava and measure pressure within the right atrium, within the right ventricle, and even advance it into a pulmonary trunk and measure pulmonary artery pressure. The point I'm getting at is I can directly measure pressures within any of the cardiac chambers. And we do so when we do a cardiac catheterization. So, this shows you some normal pressures. You're going to notice a couple of things. When you talk about pressure within the ventricles, you talk about systolic and diastolic. Okay? Because ventricles are pumps. And so they generate a peak pressure at peak systole, and as the ventricles relax, the pressure falls to the diastolic value. The pressure in the atria is much lower. The truth is, it fluctuates a little bit between systole and diastole, but they're giving you here kind of a mean pressure. It doesn't fluctuate that much. Notice that when we compare the right ventricular pressure to the left ventricular pressure, the left ventricular pressure is about 4 or 5 times higher than the right ventricular pressure, because this is a high pressure circuit. Notice that during diastole, the right ventricular pressure is the same as the pressure within the right atrium. That's because this valve is wide open during diastole, the tricuspid valve. Notice during systole, the right ventricular pressure is the same as the pulmonary artery systolic pressure. Why? Because during systole, this valve is wide open. Okay? So there's a rhyme and a reason. Same thing is true on the left side. During diastole, the left ventricular